The big question for this, or one of the big questions that can emerge from this discussion, is how does the Athenian democracy that talks about kind of equality and fair play in their own politics within their own city, how do they start making the decision to oppress others and form a tyranny over many other cities in Greece to basically create an empire, what we today call empire, which is invade some other place and oppress those people and take their stuff. It's a pretty simplistic version of empire. So the Athenians do that, even though they claim to be a democracy. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic. So we'll talk about the beginnings and the rise of this Athenian empire in the immediate aftermath of the Persian Wars, which we left off with last time, and go into kind of how Athens, they rebuild their own city in a lot of ways to house this democracy and protect it and even worship the idea of democracy and advertise it, at least amongst themselves. And we'll talk about kind of internal problems within the democracy, especially as we get into Socrates. Let's see. So this is a map of a lot of the different Greek cities. Not nearly all 1,000 of them are on this map, but a whole bunch of the most important Greek cities. And it's kind of color-coded because the Greek cities joined two different kinds of alliances. Each city had a choice when the Persians were invading. The cities in the red areas, especially down on the Peloponnesus, they mostly had big land armies. They were good at fighting on land. So they had a bunch of soldiers, well-trained. And so they joined an alliance led by Sparta called the Peloponnesian League. And those are the land armies that go out to fight the Persian army to try to stop the Persian invasion. A lot of the other cities here on this map in yellow don't have great armies, but they have much better navies. They have warships. And so they join a different alliance called the Delian League, led by Athens. And they get all their boats together and they attack the Persian navy. Does that make sense? So really, whichever one of these two your city is a member of really depends on what military strengths your city has. Okay? Okay. And the Persians are defeated in, 479, somewhere around there. And the Persians eventually go home. And the result of that is that these two military alliances in Greece, they don't have anyone to fight. The Spartans decide to basically end their alliance, to send all their soldiers back home, especially in Sparta itself, because the city leaders are worried about the possibility of a slave uprising in Sparta. So the Spartan armies and the Peloponnesian armies basically go back home once the Persians have left the area. The Athenian leaders seem to think that this is a really good opportunity. Athens, internally, they take a vote in their own city about whether or not to dissolve their naval alliance, their Delian League, and they vote to keep it. And they justify this by saying to all their allied cities, all their kind of treaty friends, we don't know if the Persians are going to start another invasion a few years from now, so we should keep this naval alliance kind of in place just in case. A lot of the other cities disagree and they don't want to be a part of this anymore because they're paying high taxes, they're contributing soldiers and warships, it's expensive. And a lot of them say, why are we paying for all this when there's no war going on? So they don't really like the just-in-case argument that Athens put out there. And they really get upset when Athens starts sending messages out that they will force all of these cities to stay in the alliance by military threat. So if one city wants to get out of it and break away, then Athens will take the navy from all the cities and attack that one city and maybe destroy it and massacre all the people. Does that make sense? So this quickly turns from a kind of cooperative alliance to protect themselves against an invasion, turns very quickly toward Athens taking control of it and really oppressing a lot of the member cities. Does that make sense? And the Athenian leaders say, no, we're not that bad. We're just doing this to keep the money coming in so we can provide mutual defense for all the cities. So they try to justify this for a couple of decades. They don't even keep the money in Athens at first. They keep it on an island called Delos, which is here in the center on this map. That's why it's called the Delian League. They named it after that island. And they keep the money there from all the cities. Delos is the treasury, basically. And I think it's 454, so about 25 years into this argument, Athens makes the decision to take all the money off of Delos and put it in Athens itself. And that's the act that most historians point at as the obvious statement that we're in control, everyone else has to follow orders or possibly be massacred. Does that make sense? So, questions about any of that at all? Nope. Yeah.
How did the Spartan area respond to this unification?
Well, when a lot of these Greek cities are arguing against Athens, saying this is unnecessary, you're getting too heavy-handed, a lot of them immediately look to Sparta for like an anti-Athens leadership because they were long-term rivals already. So, yeah, Sparta and the Spartan leaders start making statements eventually saying Athens has gotten out of line. Maybe a bunch of these cities should join together and kind of smack Athens down and teach them a lesson. They can't get away with this stuff. But Sparta is reluctant for a while to take like a real direct action. They say things. Sometimes they make promises. But for a while, there's no open warfare between Athens and Sparta. But Sparta will eventually leave. The result of that is that the Spartans will eventually bring their armies back together. They'll rebuild the Peloponnesian League in order to attack Athens and stop it. So obviously a lot of the cities in this yellow area really like Sparta. They can't say so publicly, but some of them start making, secret deals and send spies and all those kinds of things. So this is going to be two empires basically colliding with each other. Yeah.
Well, how is it that the Persians didn't just push back and take that land on the edge of that continent?
They'll keep trying. At the end of this long-term war between Sparta and Athens, Sparta will eventually win, and they do so by getting help from Persia. And in order to pay off the Persians, they actually give a bunch of that land back.
So that's after the...
Yeah, this is 100 years later. Yeah. So this rivalry, which eventually breaks out into open warfare between the Spartan Peloponnesian League and the Athenian Delian League, will go on for a long time, for about 100 years. So we're going to cover about a 100-year conflict in the next 20 minutes or so. That's what we do in these big intro classes. It's really kind of crazy. Like, again, if you go to university and there's a whole class based on the Peloponnesian Wars you take for the whole semester. You learn all the internal mess of all the battles and all the treachery and politicians and whatnot. But we just don't have that kind of time here in an intro class. Other questions? Oh, okay. And this is a kind of modern picture of Athens, picture from today, of what is called the Acropolis. The Acropolis is up on a big hilltop overlooking Athens itself, the city. So this is a much higher elevation, and it's basically a very rocky kind of mountain. And it existed back in the ancient world, all the way going back to the Mycenaean era, so before the Greek Dark Age that we talked about before. And there was a building up here that in the Mycenaean era was thought to have been like a royal palace of the king of Athens, basically. So the building was always there, and after the Dark Age, it appears that this is like a kind of a fortress for the Athenians. Whenever they're under attack and their city is being invaded, a lot of the fighting men kind of go up into this hill, and this is like their last stand to defend their city. So it's like a fort, basically. It's a military position. It's called the Acropolis. Generally, that's the whole hilltop. And they had this building, and in the Persian Wars, the Persian army actually invaded and conquered a big piece of Athens. And when the Persian army got up to the hilltop, they burned the building, basically, destroyed it. And the Athenians said after the Persian Wars, after they had beaten the Persians and the Persians had left, the Athenian political leaders said that they should never rebuild the buildings on the Acropolis. They wanted to remain rubble as a reminder of how horrible the Persians are and how desperately the Athenians need to learn to defend their city, basically. So they leave it in rubble for a little while, for a few years. But when they start to build this Athenian empire, they're sucking so much money and resources out of all those other Greek cities, Athens becomes extremely rich. Athens becomes the richest city in all of Greece almost immediately after the Persian Wars. So it's the center of wealth and power. And like a lot of places that are center of wealth and power, they look to kind of build things on a monumental, grand scale to advertise how wealthy and powerful they are. So after the Persian Wars, after a few years, they actually rebuild the buildings on the Acropolis. And they'll launch into a major building phase in the 440s, what they call the Grand Temple, which is the one in the kind of back, the old, theoretically by legend, the old king's palace. So this is a smaller model of what the completed buildings would have looked like in ancient times. And they are extremely large buildings, built to about the greatest perfection that they could possibly get it. So they're very, very tall. I mean, there will be statues inside the building that are over 60 feet tall. So the building itself is massive. And they hire all the best mathematicians and engineers and architects they could possibly find. And the big building in the back becomes known as the Parthenon. Here's a model depiction of what the Parthenon would have looked like at its height. And a person would only be about this tall compared to the building. The building is 80 or 100 feet tall. It's massive. And it's built out of basically marble, stone. There's a lot of interesting things about the Parthenon. The remains are still there. The ruins of the Parthenon are still there. And they've been studied by architects and mathematicians and whatnot. It seems that none of the columns are the same height as each other. And modern architects think that's because probably the guys who designed the building in the first place knew that when you look at something very large, the further you are away from something, it seems to get smaller. So they designed some pillars to be taller so that even from a distance it looked perfectly level. Does that make sense? And not just from one vantage point, but from many all the way around. So they're mathematical architectural geniuses that are building this massive structure. And they call it the Parthenon because a big part of the building has this giant statue inside for the goddess Athena, who was thought to be basically like a purified virgin, and it's her purity and power that is helping Athens rise in wealth and prosperity. So one of the big rooms in the building is kind of the chamber room of the goddess. And there's several models that you can find of what the statue would have looked like. You can see from, especially this one on the left, that the statue tends to basically dominate the inside. Right? It takes up all the empty space, really. And this is the height of the person down here. So the statue is about 60 feet tall. In its own time, The statue itself was made out of ivory, so perfectly kind of scrubbed white, especially for the skin tone of the goddess. And her clothes are complete gold. And we don't still have the statue itself anymore, but according to like visitors' letters and diaries entries and people who saw this thing in the ancient world who wrote about it, the goddess appeared to hold like a mini god in her hand that was something like 6 or 7 feet tall. So that would be the size of like a really tall person just standing in her hand. And kind of written testimonials say there's a big pool of water in front of the goddess. And they said it looked really cool, especially at sunrise, because the door going in faced perfectly east. So that right when the sun would come over the landscape, the sun would hit this thing and light it all up, obviously, because it's gold. And then you'd see the reflection in the water also. So it's like just gold shining, reflecting all around the building. And it was a public space for people to come worship, people from the city. And she appears also to have some kind of weaponry, a shield, and some kind of spear. So she is a kind of fighting type of goddess. She's there to defend the city. It's like the city's patron goddess. Some archaeologists think that they also put the pool of water out because Athens tends to have a very dry climate, which can really warp ivory. So they may have put the pool of water in there to humidify the room so that the statue wouldn't be destroyed just by the natural elements. The statue room was down here in what on this little kind of floor plan type map is labeled as room 3. So that was the statue room. There's another room behind it that's even bigger. And we believe that's where the Athenians put all the gold from their empire. That's where the treasury was. And there's no way to get from one room that we know of to get from the statue room into the treasury room. You have to go around and go to the opposite side of the building. So just by looking at it, the treasury room is at least twice as large as the statue room. So that indicates to us they had a whole lot of money to store. And I'm going to show you the other image. As you walked in, you had all these images all along the kind of periphery of the building, the outside walls, and then up into this kind of the arch to basically hold up the roof. So they decorated this in extreme detail with a lot of their different kind of stories and heroes and gods and goddesses and whatnot. And some of that still remains, at least the leftovers of it. And this is just to decorate the doorway, but imagine the amount of artistry and effort that has to go in to turning a piece of rock into something where you can see like the garments kind of flowing in the wind. It's pretty unbelievable, at least to my not artistic, talented type of mind. And they fill up virtually every ounce of space that they have for these depictions, all the way down to the point where when you get into the kind of corner, people have to kind of like kneel down or lay down just to get into the amount of space that's available. And that's the Parthenon itself. This is what the Parthenon looks like generally today. So the kind of outline structure is still there, the major columns. Has suffered a lot because it's a military place for the city. So when Athens eventually gets invaded, this place comes under attack and will remain under attack by different invading armies for a couple thousand years. The worst instance was in the 1600s when the Ottomans invaded and conquered the area, and they, in what one of my teachers said was like one of the biggest crimes in all of human history, they used it as a munitions dump. So they put all their gunpowder for their army in the Parthenon. And when the rebels just happened to fire basically a cannonball that exploded, got a direct hit onto the building, all the gunpowder inside exploded and destroyed virtually the entire interior. So there's a lot of historians and art historians that hate the people who decided to put gunpowder in that building in the first place, because apparently there was a lot of the original work still left over from the ancient times still in the building. So when the gunpowder went, it took all that ancient statuary and whatnot with it, just blew it inside out. So it's still there today, and it's one of the most heavily visited kind of tourist sites in at least all of Eastern Europe, if not the whole world. But going back to the kind of smaller model, that's the Parthenon in the background, and they even built this other really big, intimidating building, because you come walking up the hill, kind of this direction going to the right, and you'd have to make this kind of dramatic left to get into basically just a gateway type building that they called the Propylaea. That was another massive building that you had to walk through just to get into the area where the Parthenon was. So they built that massive structure at extreme cost because they have the money. And they largely have the money because they're an empire ruling over other Greek cities. Does that make sense? So you see a lot of empires, or at least the imperial center, the capital city, built a lot of that stuff, and oftentimes it's with basically stolen money. Does that make sense? Questions about any of that? Nope. Moving on. Okay. All right. But the thing to remember about Athens is that there's still a democracy, at least internally. So going kind of further into the 400s, they still have their vote of the citizens, the 6,000 citizens at the Panaeus. They still have open debate for adult male citizens. So a lot of people ask, why would a democracy choose to oppress other people? And one argument that historians have come up with is that a lot of these guys out there voting on the Panaeus get bribed. There's wealthy, powerful companies in Athens, and they realize that if they can get their government to enforce this empire and keep all these other cities under control, then that company could have access to those cities' outside resources and the market of those cities. Does it make sense? So they want the resources to make products out of, and they want the market to sell those products to. So empire is very profitable for the imperialists. And some historians argue that these companies realized it, and they take some of their profit and they bribe voters to get them to support oppressing all these other cities so that this company can make money. There's a lot of debate amongst historians about how widespread the bribery is. Some historians don't think it's so much a bribery as much as just a willful ignorance amongst the voters. That these company leaders get up and they give big speeches about how great it will be for Athens to control all these other cities. And a lot of the men don't really question it very much. They say, yes, whatever is good for this company must be good for our whole city. Yep.
So you said that Sparta had a kind of military academy thing going on. Did
Yep.
Athens have anything academic-wise on schooling for?
Yep. Well, Athens will become many historians argue because democracy, you have some amount of like freedom of speech.
So during this time too,
Yeah.
because you know how, like nowadays, people, America, they're like, oh, you need to be educated to know how your vote counts and how.
Yeah, they have massive education systems in Athens. They're probably some of the best in all of ancient Greece. And for that reason, a lot of the best philosophers in all of ancient Greece, out of all of 1,000 cities, a whole lot of them come out of Athens. Because there's an open opportunity for education, and because it's a democracy where people's opinions are like valued on some level, there's a certain amount of kind of freedom of speech. So you can get away with saying a lot of stuff. You can raise a lot of questions, which is really what philosophy is based on, is kind of asking questions about things and debating. Much harder to do that in a dictatorship, because in dictatorships there's a lot of stuff they don't want people talking about or thinking about. So they punish philosophers, sometimes torturing them to death. Does that sound familiar? It's still going on today. There's a lot of countries that you just can't ask certain questions in, or else you'll get punished. You've heard of these things? No?
Isn't North Korea pretty?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It seems to be a massive amount of things on their censorship list, to the point they don't even want visitors coming into their country. So yeah, but not just North Korea. It's a lot of different dictatorships all over the place. But in Athens, there's a certain amount of kind of freedom of speech. So that means that wealthy kind of corporate leaders are able to go around society and give big speeches at the assembly and put their idea out there. And many historians argue that the other voting men of Athens may have just been kind of lazy. They just accepted these ideas and said, "Oh yeah, that sounds great," and like very little criticism. Even though some of these ideas will obviously enrich the company leaders and may do harm to virtually everybody else. So, like, those kind of problems still continue, and there's candidates running for office who keep saying we need to cut taxes on the richest people in the country, and that'll benefit everybody. That's been tried before in a lot of different places, in a lot of different times, and it never works. But some people still believe it. Does it make sense? You've heard of these things? Yeah, have to cut corporate taxes, cut taxes on the rich. Like, wait a minute, I'm not rich. Why should I vote for this? You ever had these thoughts before? No? You guys are dead to the world? Some people are, apparently. But that's the two methods that historians argue that a lot of the kind of imperialistic types of leaders and voices start to gain power in Athens. It's either through bribery or just through convincing people to accept things that are not in their own interest. And one guy who starts questioning a lot of this stuff, starting with bribery, is really Socrates. Why are you taking money and supporting someone else's position? And he starts asking this question publicly. And he goes from there and starts questioning, especially people's kind of willful ignorance, their willingness to accept what their leaders tell them, rather than asking questions or doing research or anything like that to get some amount of criticism going of the leadership. And Socrates he's getting to be an older guy by the time he starts this. He was publicly involved in the Athenian government, like most Athenian male citizens were. He had been a member of the Council of 500 several times. He led a few invasions as a general. He was an Athenian general. So he starts asking these kind of questions in his retirement years, basically. And he doesn't just ask these questions at the assembly when speeches are being given. Basically, his average day is kind of wandering around the city and talking to random people. So if you've ever been like sitting at like some kind of outdoor restaurant right on the side of the street and you're eating your lunch and maybe talking to your friends or something, and this guy comes walking along and asks you, "What do you think about democracy? What do you think freedom means? what do you think about this tax proposal? What do most of us do? Or what do most of you do?
Don't care.
Yeah, right, I don't know. I don't think about it. Just leave me alone. And he got really upset with that because he basically accused all those people saying that as being willfully ignorant. They'd rather think about their sandwich than like big government or political problems that really affect their daily lives. And so Socrates kind of got into people's face about it on a daily basis for years and years and years. And he basically just questioned authority. He just walked around the society and talked to anyone he ran into. And would question government policy, ask people what they know about it and what they think about it. And then try to convince them it's important to think about those things. But didn't just talk about government kind of stuff. Would talk about, ask questions about social norms. Or just general social beliefs about freedom. Or if the Athenian people think their city is so great in every way, he'll ask them why they think their city is great. And he'll keep going. If you think this place is so great, how can you justify that? So a lot of people over the years get pretty annoyed with him, especially going into the late 400s. And he would even question his own ideas, and he would do so publicly. His own kind of default stance on things. So he raised that level of criticism to his own decisions, his own ideas. And that takes sometimes a pretty brave person to do. Question your own motivations. Not just questioning whether or not I should do something, but what is motivating me to do something or not do something. So that really strikes down into kind of your own individual character. And of course he did it to other people too, so a lot of people didn't like him because they thought he was being mean to them or something. But he calls this open public questioning, and he says this is the source of democracy, basically. You cannot have democracy without people asking questions publicly. So if people stop asking questions, then the government will basically just rule with them, and it'll be a dictatorship, even if you have a vote. You'll just have the rulers doing what they want, and if they're not criticized, they'll just keep doing whatever they want. So he called it in his time parrhesia, which basically translates to a fearless questioning. You ask important questions no matter who it's going to insult or upset, no matter what the possible result of that question might be. The question has to be asked. And if you could answer that first level question, he would ask you why. He would keep going and going and going and going. There's no end to it in the Socratic method. And that was intended, most likely, because he didn't want people just to rely on easy answers for things or ideas that they heard someone else say, that they just kind of accepted without thinking about too much. So for Socrates, the questions never end. And he seemed to take particular joy in kind of attacking social norms that are accepted amongst most people. And he said he was just trying to get people to think for themselves, basically. And stop hiding from their responsibilities to think for themselves. Does that make sense? And over time, he's not really just doing this alone anymore. he kind of develops his own personal school. He has like this group of followers that go with him from place to place every day, and they basically debate each other all day, and they get involved in these discussions. So he just starts it at first by himself, and a few people start following him around, and he becomes thought of to be such like a wise teacher that some students follow him around for years. Does that make sense? Okay. I think that's all for Socrates for now, at least. All right. Then we get into the official Peloponnesian Wars, which is a long-term conflict, basically between the Athenian-led Delian League and the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League. That's why it becomes known as the Peloponnesian War, or wars. There's several of them. It basically goes on for nearly 100 years, largely because Sparta led a group of cities that had big land armies, and Athens led a group of cities that had big warships. They fight on the sea, and they really can't get at each other for a long time and inflict enough damage on the enemy to actually win the war. So the war kind of drags out because they try to think of ways to attack each other, but without getting into the details, it doesn't work very well for a long time. So it goes on kind of decade after decade after decade. And each side comes up with all kinds of what you might today call like Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny-ish kinds of plots to defeat the enemy. And this war spreads out into their colonies too. That's one thing Athens can do pretty well, is they can send their warships out and attack a Spartan colony or a Spartan allies colony somewhere else in the Mediterranean, because they can move around. They have boats. And if the Peloponnesian League cannot move its soldiers around quickly, they don't have many defenses in their colonies. So that's one of Athens' kind of main attack strategies. And also try to form like naval blockades around their enemies to basically lay siege and starve them out. Does anyone want to take a guess at what the Spartan strategy was? How do they want to win this war? On land, and what do you do on land? What's their idea? What's their big plan? Yeah, attack. They say, well, Athens is on land, so that's helpful to us. So let's just take a bunch of our soldiers and march out to Athens, conquer the city, and that'll be the end of the war.
It's the war.
Yep. Oops. Well, there's the map of, again, the yellow and the red, the land-based armies and the warships on the seas. All right, so Sparta, they launch a really big invasion of this area around Athens called Attica. So they take this big Peloponnesian Spartan-led army, and they just basically march over land and try to walk to Athens and invade and conquer the city. Sounds like a good idea, because Athens is actually not really close. It's not right on their coastline. Athens is a little bit inland from their major port at Piraeus. So the Spartans figure, we can just take our army and surround Athens and lay siege and starve them out, or at least starve them until they surrender. So when this whole conflict gets going, one of the Athenian leaders named Pericles has a big idea. His idea is, let's build these giant walls around Athens so the Spartans cannot, attack us and conquer our city directly. It seems it's a normal kind of ancient world defense strategy. But he says we should also build walls around Piraeus so that they cannot conquer our port city. And then we'll build other walls to connect them, basically like an umbilical cord between Piraeus and Athens itself. Does that make sense? So build this kind of highway with giant walls on each side, so that when the Spartans invade, all this land around Athens is like basically farmland. When the Spartans invade, all the Athenian farmers, they can all hide behind the walls, stay in the city, but they won't starve because they can still get their boats into port and unload their whatever food and supplies they need, and basically walk them down this highway, this umbilical cord, and get into Athens and resupply the population. Does that make sense? So these become known as the long walls that connect Athens to the port. And it works really well. Basically, the Spartans invade. The Athenians hide behind the walls, and the Spartans sit down and wait for the Athenians to starve, but they don't starve. They stay in their city, and the Spartan soldiers do everything they can possibly think about here in the countryside to get the Athenian army to come out and fight. So they first start launching insults. They start saying, "Oh, you're a bunch of women for hiding behind the walls, a bunch of wusses, why don't you come out and fight like men?" That doesn't really work. Because if you're a weaker army, you don't want to come out and fight the Spartans because you're going to be massacred. So being insulting doesn't really help. Then they start burning down the Athenian farms. They just start setting them all on fire. Trying to force the Athenian army to come out and defend their farmland. The Athenians won't come out. They even try what we today call biological warfare. They take some dead bodies that had died of the plague, and they launch them over the walls into the city to spread a plague in the city to try to convince the people to come out of the city or surrender. That doesn't even work. They'd rather take their chances with the plague. And the plague even killed Pericles and other Athenian leaders. So it was a really, destructive piece of warfare by the Spartans. Pretty brutal. But the Athenians still won't come out and fight. They can still pull their boats up to the port and unload and get enough supplies to at least try to survive. And this goes on for decades. Does it make sense? So, questions about that? Nope. And this whole time, Socrates and others are running around the city saying, this is a catastrophe, our government leaders are either corrupt or stupid, and we need to be thinking for ourselves and questioning authority and doing all this. So Socrates is running around in the city at this crisis moment, asking all these questions. And, eventually, the Athenians, under a really bad decision, I think it's 404, they actually send their army out to fight the Spartans. And what happens? They get massacred. So Athens loses the war at that point, right around the year 400. So from around the year 400 into the next few decades, Sparta is the dominant city over all of Greece. And Sparta kind of is increasingly heavy-handed with the other Greek cities. So Sparta went into this conflict promising all the other cities, we're just going to help you, regain your independence and destroy Athens' power, and then we'll all be happy again. It appears that Sparta did much the same thing as Athens did. They saw a good opportunity. The enemy has been defeated. There's no one else to stop us from taking over. So let's try it. And a lot of other cities didn't like that. And they did the exact same thing they did to Sparta, or they did to Athens. They start rising up and rebelling against Sparta's leadership to the point where the Spartan army actually loses a giant battle in 371 against a couple other cities. And that brings Sparta down. So in the end, neither side in the Peloponnesian War kind of, quote, won the conflict. They were both dragged down. Not completely annihilated, but dragged down to the level of some other major cities. So neither Sparta nor Athens is dominant going into the mid-300s. There's still big, strong cities, but not any stronger than any of the other really big cities. Remember, there's 1,000 of them, so. Does that make sense? No? So that's the Peloponnesian War in 15, 20 minutes. It goes on for 100 years, give or take, and it's tough to skip past or to get into the details with the kind of class we have. There's two different major wars for you to remember in ancient Greece. There's first the Persian War, which is pretty obvious. It's a Persian invasion. And then the Peloponnesian War is basically the Greek Civil War, the real big one that does a lot of damage. And basically the Greek cities go back to their normal level of infighting. There's 1,000 different cities, and they're all fighting each other for power and resources and whatnot. So that continues. A lot of them don't trust each other at all. So there's a lot of kind of backstabbing and corrupt deal making amongst the cities. And probably the poster boy for that kind of distrust, is actually a guy from Athens named Alcibiades. And he has a funny, interesting career. He is a pretty young guy. He was reportedly one of Socrates' best students. Best at debate, basically. So he becomes a kind of political leader at this crisis point right when the Spartans are invading. And actually a lot of the Athenian kind of governmental leaders and guys on the assembly, they wanted to end this war once the Spartans invaded because they realized this is potentially going to be catastrophic for Athens. So a group of kind of leading Athenians get together and they start negotiating a peace treaty with Sparta. Does that make sense? Whereas Alcibiades has taken a public stance, a kind of pro-war stance at the assembly, arguing we're the greatest city and we should fight. So he doesn't want to see a peace treaty, because if there's peace, then he won't be a popular politician anymore. Does that make sense? His political enemies will get all the credit for getting the peace negotiated and ending the war. They'll be popular, and he'll be forgotten. Does that make sense to you? So he gets himself, after giving a speech, he gets himself appointed to the group that is negotiating the treaty in order to kill it. He put demands into that negotiation that he knew Sparta would never agree to, specifically to piss them off and basically torpedo the negotiations completely, to get so much animosity built up on both sides that they couldn't even talk to each other anymore. Is that clear? Yes? No? And, in retrospect, peace would have been the best thing for his city. But this shows you some politicians don't really care about what's best for the whole group. They care about what's best for themselves. Right? You obviously still see that going on. No? So he's a leading Athenian politician. He destroys, through this kind of discussion, destroys the peace negotiations, so they're still at war. And then he gives a speech at the assembly where he proposes a major invasion of one of Sparta's colonies in Sicily. And the assembly approves it. So they're going to take a bunch of their warships, and his argument is basically if we conquer this colony, then Sparta will lose access to money, and their economy will be hurt, and they'll give up. And they like it so much that they appoint him to be general of the invasion of Sicily because it's his idea. And this is something that Athens very often did. Whoever came up with the battle plan, the idea for an invasion, would be kind of put in charge of it. So for a while, he is kind of gathering the forces together. He's spending the money, building up this invasion force. And on the appointed day, it leaves harbor to go off and invade Sicily. And after the invasion fleet left, they basically leave at dawn. And in the morning of that same day, a lot of Athenian people they start milling around in the city and whatnot. They start to notice a lot of the statues of their gods have been defaced in pretty insulting ways to the gods. Does that make sense? Which a lot of Athenians get really worried about, because if you do that, you piss off the gods may send some kind of catastrophe to the city as punishment, right? And they just launch this big invasion. So they start getting really worried about who did this, and the idea is the government needs to find out who did this and punish them to appease the gods, so the gods won't send otherworldly punishment against the city. And during the investigation, rumors start to spread that Alcibiades led a bunch of drunk frat guys out in the middle of the night, and they're the ones who did all the damage to the statues. So the city government basically issues an arrest warrant for Alcibiades. They send messengers out to the fleet, the invasion fleet, that he's on the boats, he's out of town, to arrest him and bring him back to Athens to basically stand trial. And Alcibiades gets really worried about this, because if he's found guilty, he's going to be executed. So what does he do? He runs. Yeah, he runs away. He can't go back to Athens. He can't go to any city that is one of Athens' friends, because they're just going to turn him over. So where does he go? Yeah, he goes to Sparta. And he basically goes to Sparta. He sneaks away before he can be caught, gets to Sparta, and goes to the Spartan government and says, "You better watch out. There's this giant invasion that's about to hit one of your colonies." How do I know this? Because I planned it. I know exactly when and where and how the invasion is going to happen. And the Spartans don't really trust him very much, but why not send a few soldiers with him to go defend this colony just in case? And since he knows the Athenian battle plan, they make him a general in the defense against his own invasion. Does it make sense? So he takes some Spartan troops to the colony in Sicily to defend against his own invasion. And what do you know? It works. He's successful. He defeats the Athenians. He leads Spartan soldiers. Or he doesn't really lead them. He gives them orders where and when to go out and fight. And the Spartans win the battle. So he has completely sold out his own city to save himself. And he goes back to Sparta a hero. So he's living in Sparta for a little while, and rumors start to spread that Alcibiades is kind of a lustful young guy. He likes to drink, he likes to party, he likes to do wild things. Rumors start to spread in Sparta that he seduced the Spartan king's wife, the queen, which is a bad thing to do in dictatorship. So the Spartan king wants to have him killed. So now he can't stay in Sparta, so he has to run away from Sparta. But he can't go back to Athens because they hate him. So where does he go?
Persia.
He goes to Persia. Oops, well, Spartan general. Right. So yeah, he goes to Persia. The kind of ancient, well-known enemy of all Greek cities, because he thinks the Persians will protect him if he can offer them something useful. And the thing he offers is to... he goes as an advisor. He starts working as an advisor to the Persian emperor. And the Persians don't trust him at all. So the Persians say, "We'll listen to you. We'll give you a job here. If you can somehow get one side or the other in this Greek war to join with Persia so we can intervene and eventually take over all of Greece." And so he figures he has a better chance at doing that in Athens, to convince the Athenians to join Persia in an alliance against Sparta. But the Persians don't trust the Athenian democracy, so they tell him, you have to overthrow the Athenian democracy, set up a dictatorship that you run, and then we'll trust you. So he actually does that. He goes back to Athens, overthrows the Athenian democracy for a little while, sets up a dictatorship in order to keep the trust of the Athenian people. He plans an Athenian invasion of another Spartan holding. So they make him an Athenian general again. But this time when he doesn't really lead the troops on the battlefield, he kind of designs the invasion plan. So he's not actually fighting himself. He kind of stays in the back and watches the battle. But that battle doesn't go well for Athens. The Athenian army loses pretty humiliating way. So they eventually kick him out of Athens. They exile him for life. They don't ever want this guy in their city again because he's so untrustworthy. And the Persians don't trust him, so he basically goes north into northern Greece, which is really kind of backwater, mountainous kind of place where he can hide and not be killed. But in the end, nobody trusts this guy. He started out as a young, smooth-talking type of politician, but you can see this takes like many years, 20 some odd years to go through this whole process. But his life is a giant soap opera, with backstabbing and selling out whenever it was in his best interest to do so. And he's not the only politician that does this. In fact, entire cities do this to each other throughout the Peloponnesian Wars. But he's a good kind of symbol of it. So he's symbolic of this mistrust that the cities had of each other. And this is why they hate each other. Does it make sense? Yeah.
So he went to Athens with the Persian fleet and they conquered Athens to conquer Sparta then?
Well, he didn't go back with a fleet. He went back to Athens and convinced a lot of people that were upset with the democracy for screwing up the war that it would be better for the city to overthrow the democracy and take over and kind of run the war better, basically. Does it make sense?
But if this democracy isn't already run by the people, so overthrowing a democracy would just...
Yeah. So it's like saying, some group within the U.S. military says, under a general, they say, well, this whole democracy thing isn't working. We've really destroyed our own society. So this part of the army is going to overthrow Washington, D.C., create a whole new government, and run the society better. And some people feel so desperate that they believe it. Right? Does it make sense? Yeah.
But then that doesn't work out too well, so then they kick him out?
No, because he leads them into a battle that's a catastrophe itself, and so they don't trust him at all.
And that was a battle with Sparta.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who like the democracy in the first place hate this guy, and they're looking for any good opportunity to get rid of him and get rid of this new dictatorship. And sometimes that happens with dictatorships when they suffer some kind of really humiliating public thing. That inspires a lot of people who want democracy to overthrow it and get rid of them. Does that make sense? And we've seen that even in recent times, just in the past few years. So yeah, it's kind of politics. That's what happens. You take your risks when you go into politics, especially if you want to build a dictatorship. Because if you don't trust a dictator, what's the best way to make sure they don't ever try this again? Kill them. So yeah, a lot of times you overthrow a dictatorship, or a dictatorship gets overthrown. The former dictators, the leadership all gets massacred, and often their whole families get massacred to make sure they can never make a comeback. I mean, that happened at the end of the Cold War. They overthrew some dictators. They kind of put them in prison for a little while, waiting trial. But some people broke into the prison in the middle of the night and took those guys out back and just machine gunned them. And I think there's video, you can even watch that on YouTube. It's broadcast to the world at the time. I think it was the leader of Romania, if I remember right. They took him and his wife out back of the building and just shot him.
Wasn't there one of Hungary, something like that, too?
I can't remember what happened in Hungary. There's a lot of dictatorships were overthrown within 2 months, so it was fairly chaotic. But those dictators have been in office for 40 years. So So yeah, interesting things happen. Other questions?
And who were the main people like writing all this stuff down? Was it like a larger group of people, or?
Oh, there's a historian who lives through a bunch of this stuff and actually writes it down as it happens. I think it's Thucydides who lived through this and wrote down histories of the battles, almost like a journalist. And kept track of it all. And Thucydides, if you ever see one of his books, it's just massive. It's basically a retired guy who's keeping track of all this stuff.
And then how do we trust it?
Well, that's one of the big questions for historians, especially if you're only looking at one book as evidence of something. That's like anti-scholarship. Scholarship is basically you look at all the sources, you read everything that's ever been written on this one topic, and so you understand all the perspectives and you can make up your own mind. The opposite of that is going with just one source and believing that that is perfectly true and accurate.
So if you only have one source of that time period, then you're kind of screwed.
Yep. That's one of the problems with studying ancient history, is that a lot of times you have to go with the one source and try to just figure out for yourself from the text itself where are the biases within it, right? So yeah.
So a lot of this could just be like a story.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of archaeological evidence to support that these things at least happened, and there's other records that have been found of like people writing letters to each other and whatnot, public speeches. So we believe the events happened, but that they happened in the exact ways and for the exact reasons that Thucydides said they happened. That's the big question. So it's just like if you only read the LA Times, and that's the only source you rely on for all of your news, you're going to get their perspective, but you might not get views from other cities or other parts of the world. So my advice is never rely on just one news source or define one source as like absolutely pure or good or honest or truthful or anything like that. Look at all the stuff, or at least as much as you can, because we have a lot of news sources today. And for world events, even for events in the United States, read news sources from around the world. So today there's there's Al Jazeera English, there's Der Spiegel from Germany, there's a Guardian in London, in Britain. There's Mosaic, which is a kind of news source that brings together independent news sources from all over the Middle East and North Africa. There's all kinds of things out there. No. One of my favorite ones right now is called The Intercept. It got started a couple of years ago. And that's run by several big contributors. Some are in Britain, some are in Brazil, some are in the United States. They have a pretty critical view of things. No?
They say before the Alexandria Library, when they kept the old records
Yeah.
from the ancients before it got burned.
Yep. You get those kind of archives.
Some
Yeah.
good stuff there.
Yeah, and that's what historians mostly do professionally. They go into archives. They basically ask a question, what we call a research question. Why did Alcibiades choose to do this in Sparta at this moment? And they try to go in and find all the original documents. And they sometimes spend years reading all that stuff to try to formulate an answer to their question. They write an article or a book or something about it. Yeah, that's what historians generally do. And there's still historians of the Peloponnesian Wars today. It's not like, a couple people wrote it down a few hundred years ago and it's never been studied since. Every generation has its kind of experts in one field or the other. Does that make sense? Yeah, so sometimes historians spend whole lifetimes studying just one thing we talk about, literally for only 30 seconds in this class. They really want to know, and they go to as many sources as they can possibly find. Historians are actually really paranoid of being accused of not having read everything, of starting to publish their research before they finished reading all the evidence. So historians tend to read everything they can possibly get their hands on. Sometimes spend 5 or 10 years just reading it. So yeah.
A lot of material.
Yeah. And if you're going to do something with like Alcibiades or the Peloponnesian Wars, you oftentimes, just to even start asking those questions, you have to read what all the other historians have written. So that could take years in itself. Yep. That's what graduate school is, for historians at least. Spend a couple years learning what all the other historians in that field said. Once you've mastered all that stuff, and you have to prove it in a test, then you're allowed to do your own research. If you're interested.